Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Advisory Advantage, the podcast for accountants and business advisors who want to learn in practical, relevant ways how to market, sell, and deliver more business advisory services and financial advisory services to their clients. I'm MC Carter, founder of Practice Paradox, a global digital marketing agency for accountants, and I'm willingly aided and abetted today by my good friend across the ditch.
Thanks, MC. Yeah, Richard Francis, CEO of Spotlight Reporting and advisor accountant for the last couple of decades before I did that. So, really looking forward to this series that we're bringing out to you all. Delighted to have Chris Hooper here as our very first guest. Chris won't need much of an intro to many of you. CEO of Accodex, he's very popular on social. But I am going to get Chris to kick off with, tell us about Accodex and how that's kind of the pivot for your whole journey.
So Accodex is a global network of, I call it angry young accountants. So we've got offices in Adelaide, Australia, the United Kingdom, North America, and the Philippines as well. We were global from day one, in my perspective. And yeah, it's growing at an astronomical breakneck rate. It's been a fun ride to date.
So, mate, you mentioned, I mentioned that you're a CEO, but you call yourself an accounting futurist. What the hell does that mean? Talk us through it.
That came by virtue of me really getting lucky in the cloud accounting space like 6-7 years ago. In fact, for posterity purposes, like for whatever reason, something compelled me at 4 a.m. in the morning, 6 or 7 years ago, to post on Facebook, like, zero is the future of accounting, and how you get those reminders every single year, this time 7 years ago, popped up. I had a small accounting practice with a mate of mine from high school. And one of the most critical decisions was, which accounting suite do we use, right? We'd made the decision to go with MYOB, which is the natural decision at the time. But, I was talking to this, sketchy Kiwi mob back in the day who were just super excited about the product. I don't know if you guys remember Xero back then, but it wasn't much to talk about. But the thing that really hooked me and compelled me to wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning, just knowing this, was really like the bank fees and their whole single ledger, theory. And I went, you know what, like if these guys, because it may not have been them, but it's like, this is where accounting is heading. And sort of 4 years into that practice, I realized from a business perspective that if I can consistently predict the future of the accounting profession and build a business around, my assertions there, then I can really future-proof my business. And that's kind of where Accodex got spun out, is based on, this huge, hypothesis and assumption that the old traditional partnership model of accounting practices is a thing of the past. And, staked my entire business around that.
So your business model, you're innovating at that level, at a very fundamental level for your business. What shifts in terms of being an accounting profession futurist? What are the main shifts that you see coming apart from the business structure, the business model in that respect? What other shifts do you see on the horizon? And I asked that framed up with, I think a lot of accountants are tired of hearing about certain shifts that vendors have been talking about for the last 20, 30 years. Yeah. So with you being, at the coalface, what are you seeing on the horizon for reality?
The number one that's still being talked about today is like cloud. In my opinion, it's been done, it's dusted, we have to move on, right? Accodex was predicated around an assumption that, these angry young accountants, the millennial generation, don't want to buy into established practices. And that they want more of a work-life balance than has previously been on offer in the accounting world. So that's a big one. Something that's been ongoing for about 20 years is the overwhelming, the gravitational pull insofar as offshoring and cost shifting is concerned. and that's really been opened up by virtue of cloud technology, because there was a huge barrier to entry to moving to low-cost countries such as India, Philippines, Vietnam, et cetera, 20 years ago, because we needed physical offices with, server infrastructure and all of that sort of stuff. Cloud has basically acted as a catalyst for that offshoring piece. I know, one-person firms that have a team overseas and they have no intentions of hiring anyone domestically. And I think that's just a sign of the times. Coming back to the technology piece, there's obviously a lot of conversation about, automation and artificial intelligence and machine learning and that sort of stuff. I think that's going to take a lot longer to kind of mature in the accounting profession, particularly because we're still stuck on this cloud conversation. But we fully acknowledge that, machine learning is going to be an important part of our business, and we've kind of just we're taking the wait and see, and we're just always looking on the horizon with respect to that one. Another huge consideration is the implications of blockchain technology on the global sort of financial industry. Again, it's too soon to tell the implications of that, but our position at Accodex is that the implications are going to be enormous. And the other one is really about, and Richard will like this one, is about data visualization, and I suppose intelligent insights or business intelligence, which is really pivotal to Accodex's mission and purpose, is about democratizing business intelligence for businesses globally. And that is, the first part is about visualization, and then the second part is about that advisory piece in terms of, okay, here's a pretty chart, but here's what it means in context, right? And that, I think, is going to be, paramount to the accounting profession in the nearer term.
Mate, I was getting a little bit scratchy until you mentioned that last one. AI, blockchain, all of that machine learning. We'll come back to that because technology is key to so much that we're doing. But one thing I pick up and it gets under my skin a bit, so I want you to delve into this. As accountants talk a lot about the technology, they talk about Xero, and our history with Xero as well, and all beautiful stuff, all really good enablers. But at the end of the day, are we giving the customers better service? Are we giving them goals to strive for and really great outcomes? So what I love hearing, and I want you to pick this up and run with it, is how's all of that cool stuff that excites you and gets you out of bed in the morning, how's that actually changing anything for your customers?
So I'll rewind a little bit for some context in a career perspective. Prior to starting my practice 7 years ago, I was working at a publicly listed company as a finance analyst. And there were probably 10 plus of me, globally. It was a 20,000 person company. And my job was basically to query the general ledger. It was some 80s DOS-based software. Query the general ledger, go get coffee, come back, CSV and be ready, chop suey that up into Excel,
nice,
and produce meaningful intelligence for management team and the board of directors. And there were, a whole bunch of us working globally doing all of that. But I mean, the intelligence off the back end was top notch, and the board and management team needed that so that they could make informed decisions about what to do with the business, right? But you can appreciate the cost of that would be in the millions to actually produce that intelligence. And, I roll out into practice, and this is really just at the infancy of, cloud accounting and business intelligence. And there were a few players in the market, yourself included. And what I realized is that, if we got, the data plumbing right, we could basically produce the same level and quality of business intelligence that I was producing for a publicly listed company in like 1/1000th of the time, and by virtue of that, 1/1000th of the cost. And that's what I mean when I talk about democratization of business intelligence, is that this intelligence that was historically reserved for humongous public companies is now accessible to, your mum and dad bakery down the road, at a reasonable price. And I realized, back then that the implications of that from a small business perspective were were insanely profound. And yeah, I suppose that's really what's at the driving force behind, what we're doing.
They still need an advisor and an accountant, though, that grasps that technology and uses it for the greater good.
Absolutely.
So, and this is, how do you sell it to them? How do you market it? Some of the stuff that MC coaches on. What's the difference between you and Accodex and look, there are lots of good firms out there doing this, but the firms who have at their fingertips the Xeros, the Spotlights, the Receipt Bank, other tools, but still don't really deploy them in anger.
So, I would probably start just by saying, if you send your customer, a report once a month without any communication around it, chances are they won't read it, or it won't add value, and they'll probably stop paying you pretty quickly.
Yep.
So it needs to come with that advice and that context. And this is where accountants can actually add a ton of value. And I think the interesting thing as well is when you talk to your average accountant on the street that's been working for 5 or 10 years about what their expectations of the profession were when they first signed up for university and, ticked the accounting box at high school, what did you think this job was going to look like? And I can absolutely tell you that it was not, putting numbers in boxes into tax returns and, double handling data. It was sitting down with the clients, going through this business intelligence and building plans around that. That's what they wanted to be doing in the first place. In terms of how we actually approach this from a client perspective, it's really just a matter of actually asking the right questions. So I say at Accodex that accountants are as a profession, as individuals, are notorious order takers. So it's kind of like client rocks up and says, hey, I need a tax return and a set of financial statements, and the accountant basically turns around and goes, here you go, done, right? So basically giving the client what they ask for. But the problem is, because accounting is a vague and mysterious profession, the client doesn't know what they don't know, right? So simply and I use this analogy that in the Codex, that prescription without diagnosis is malpractice, right? So I liken that client coming in and asking for a set of tax returns and financial statements as malpractice, right? Because if you went into your doctor today, either of you, and asked for a prescription of Vicodin, and that doctor just wrote one and then handed it to you, that would be malpractice, right? So the doctor is going to say, yeah, absolutely, Richard, I can give you that Vicodin, but before I do, I just need to ask you a few questions first, right? And that's basically how we preface the conversation around advisory, going, look, mate, absolutely, we can do your tax returns and financials. That's like a non-issue. But before we, push forward with that, I just need to ask you a few questions, and that drives a much more proactive conversation in terms of what were your goals when you first started your business? Have your goals changed since you started? What's keeping you up at night? And all of these, open-ended questions. And what you're doing here is basically diagnosing, in order to prescribe that business with what it may be, board, parachuting in like a chairman of the board type scenario. It could be reporting. It could be like front end systems for their point of sale or their e-commerce site. It could be a whole myriad of things, just like in medicine. But the number one thing is that you've got to first ask the questions before you perform a diagnosis.
Chris, on that, and before, when you were talking about you can't just send reports and print out the dashboards, you've got to give commentary on that. One of the models that we've developed is the 7 layers of value, or the value pyramid for accountants and advisors. And there's a sweet spot in the middle that firms have started to call layers 3, 4, 5. So 3rd, 4th, and 5th layers. So it's clarity, then commentary. What does this mean? Actually give the insights. And then accountability. So actually aiding execution at the business level. Now, implied in all of that is that you need advisors who are not back office grinders, number crunchers, but you need people who have at least a moderate level of expressiveness and at least a moderate level of assertiveness. So stepping back out to this angry, was it an army or horde of young accountants who have this dissonance between what they thought the profession was going to be like when they came in and what they are experiencing. How is a codex within the available labour market attracting those who are going to actually have the traits and the aptitude, be cut from the right cloth to best use the incredible data flows that you've got and the data visualization, democratization? That just makes my propeller cap just almost spin off its head. I love that stuff. But at the end of the day, how are you attracting people who can actually deliver advisory in that client communication, trust, accountability level?
Honestly, just by doing stuff like this, right? So we're not actively soliciting, people from firms. We're not advertising or putting ads in Seek or anything like that. I just publish, my thoughts on our blog, on other people's blogs, in the media. I talk at conferences, and I just talk about my beliefs about the future for the profession, for the accounting profession. And that either resonates with you in the sense that it's like, yeah, I think, he might be right about this, and I believe the same thing too. Maybe I should have a conversation with them, or it doesn't, So we're very passive in terms of, bringing these partners into the network, because the reality is, I think they've always felt this way in the first place, and it's just that. Now I've just kind of, been vocal about it. And, people are just, signing up, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. So you're getting out there with your vision and your values, and you're just attracting those who relate to that. That's wonderful. Is there any particular background? Are people coming from certain tiers of firms or sizes or locations? What's the usual type of advisor you're attracting?
So there is definitely like an archetype, if you will. And that's why I say angry young accountants is, they are in the sort of later millennial cohort. So you're talking late 20s to like late 30s.
All of us Gen Xers are angry too, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
But for different reasons.
A totally valid point. I suppose, for whatever reason, that's not the volume of like inquiries that we're getting.
Sure.
And I mean, we do have the exceptions to this rule, but the vast majority are millennials. They are, late 20s, late 30s. I would say that they're probably from mid-tier, but it's, again, bell curves, right? But I would say that the top 100 firms, maybe from 100 to 90, well, number 5 is the main one. Although we have had a couple from Big Four jump ship. But I think the thing with Big Four is that because that work is sort of super specialized, it doesn't really gel well with the general practice business services environment, is the only sort of thing I would disclaim there. And, they're obviously scattered all around the world, to the point where we have to go, no, sorry, we're not in South Africa yet. No, sorry, we don't want to be in Malaysia just quite yet. Like geography is not a factor here. They're all sort of CA, CPA, plus 5 to 10 years worth of experience. And they just want, I think, more autonomy over their lives and their careers, right? And the way Accodex is structured is very conducive to that.
So what would a typical day look like then, if they've escaped cubicle nation in a city-based firm, and are they skateboarding down the street wearing a hoodie and holding a latte? Like, just let's picture it the average day.
I might just look out my window here. For starters, in terms of our partners based in Adelaide, South Australia, not a single one of them is in the office right now, which is usually a good sign. So they're not quite skateboarding, but they're definitely like on site with clients, or they're hanging out in coffee shops or bars, lunching, coffees, drinks, etc., or on site with clients.
Brilliant.
So I think the typical day, let's say typical week, would comprise, a few hours worth of networking events, or just general like lead generation type stuff. So networking, speaking at events, running workshops, etc. Another part would be, in like sales and qualification. So meeting with prospective customers and whatnot. And then, you know, the remainder of the work is actually doing the job, right? Which would be traditionally seen as the chargeable work. And that's pretty much what the typical day looks like. I think the big difference here is that our partners set their own times because, you know, they're autonomous human beings. So like, you want to start work at 12, that's fine. You want to, you know, start work at 6 a.m. in the morning, that's fine too. You want to take 3 days off in the middle of the week and work on the weekends, that's fine too. Like, as long as, you know, it works with your clients, and the clients are getting the results that you're espousing, then everything's a-okay, you know, and you can do that from anywhere in the world.
Right.
And I think that's really what's, you know, that autonomy is really what's encouraging these guys to join.
So Chris, getting down to the nitty gritty, because all of the amazing progressive accountants who are going to be watching this are going, that's great, sounds cool, I probably want a job there actually. But what's the advisory advantage that a customer gets at Accodex? What services do you offer? And when you've told us how you're changing lives, I want to know, because the accountants watching this are going to want to know, how are you monetizing this?
Yep. So like, the advisory piece is, I suppose, a couple of different layers. So the first most obvious one is the reporting, which is we lean toward, especially if the client has come from no business intelligence, we lean heavily toward line in the sand month-end reporting before we rush into dashboards, right? Because dashboards in accounting are basically useless unless the accounts are clean, right? So we have a very sort of rigorous month-end process with all of these clients to make sure that what's being reported in those month-end reports is accurate, because at the end of the day, we have to put our name to it. You know, you've got the reporting there. With that comes a monthly sit-down meeting, which can go anywhere from 2 hours to a full day.
Face-to-face, Zoom?
Again, depends on client location. I would say the majority is face-to-face because there's still that sort of, you know, geographic closeness, touchy-feely type thing. But, you know, we have partners that are servicing clients, you know, overseas and stuff like that. So geography definitely isn't a barrier, but I think proximity is definitely part of the upside, right? So yeah, those meetings can last from like 2 hours to kind of full days, minimum like monthly in terms of the sit down, because you need that. And coming back to that diagnosis question, if you ask a client, your average SME, how often do you sit down without interruption to review the financial performance of your business? I would hazard that 99% would say never, right? And that's a problem, yeah? That's a problem from an internal controls perspective, and that's a problem because, you know, from a business growth and profitability perspective. So simply by sitting down objectively, you know, with no distractions, and reviewing the financial performance of the business once a month, we can see a dramatic improvement in terms of cash flow and profitability.
Do you use sorry to interrupt, Chris, but do you use a framework to, you know, obviously the numbers are a really great kind of foundation for that, but do you use a framework like, you know, have you set goals? Are there KPIs? Is there a strategic plan? Because this is the area, obviously I bang on a little bit about in my Transform book, but I think that's really where you embed that trusted advisor right to walk the corridors of the business angle. Do you guys get into the detail like that and really own the strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because, you know, the reporting without context isn't, you know, much value, and then commentary without purpose is, you know, of the same, right? So typically in that pre-qualification stage, before the client actually comes on for advisory services, there's a conversation about like, you know, what are your goals or where does it hurt, right? And that could be it's cash flow, it could be revenue growth, it could be, you know, GP bleed, et cetera, et cetera. So that happens before we've even, you know, provided the prescription. That obviously sets the context for at least the first 12 months of that engagement. Where we're basically making recommendations. And this is, you mentioned accountability before, that's absolutely a core component of this, because at the end of the day, it's not my business, it's not, you know, I couldn't care less, you know, if the client doesn't take the action on it, right? because it's not my livelihood that's at stake. So we have to kind of, make sure that we're constantly checking in terms of like making sure that the client or the business owner is doing what we said that we were going to do within the next 30 days. And then we're checking back on like, how did that work? Did it, where did it affect performance? And then we're obviously just doing that on a monthly basis, right? So we're checking in with the KPIs. We're then setting new like homework for the next month. And then we're checking back on that and making sure that we are making progress toward that goal.
So you've got a higher touch, lower volume model. You're doing a lot more with your clients than the typical accounting firm out there. Could it be characterized as CFO type level of services? It sounds like it's a little bit more than that because you're stepping out into some of the strategy and framework, depending on how people define what CFO means. So I'm hearing accountability, conversations, like before when we asked you what's the typical day of an advisor look like, the first three things you mentioned was FaceTime, either with the marketplace, prospects, clients, and team members. So you're having to attract a different ilk of accountant, which is brilliant. On the accountability, quick little techie question.
Yep.
Do you have a shared accountability task list in the cloud somewhere that is updated in real time? Here's what we said we were going to do in the next month. Here's what you're going to do. Or do you just manage it through email? What are your favorite tools between advisor and client?
Actually, a new feature that came out from Spotlight just recently.
That was not a paid announcement.
It's not, but you should have seen my reaction when that feature was released. Like it was probably a little overzealous. So the accountability side is actually one of the reports that we actually surface up as part of our like monthly report packs. Is basically just a status update in terms of who's doing what's the progress toward that, and then we update that every single month. In terms of the nitty gritty, in terms of like actions and tasks and that sort of stuff, we basically leave that to client side because clients have got their own sort of, Trello or Slack or, whatever, in terms of managing their own like projects internally. So typically we've got access to that to make sure that stuff's sort of moving forward. But in terms of that like line into the sand sort of checking in, that's just included in the management reports.
And with the this style of service, how are you going in terms of attracting the SMEs or the MEs who are happy to pay for that? What's your value proposition out to the business market that's attracting people who want and are willing to pay for higher level business advisory?
That's a really good question. I would say the bulk of the conversation is that they come in we say that they come for compliance, but then they stay for advisory. So we're not really trying to put it out there in terms of our external communications that, this is what we do and this is what we can do. I mean, it's communicated in our, in our marketing collateral, but it's not something that we're sort of actively like in terms of outbound marketing, like pushing out to drag people in. We've just got this natural gravity.
You're outbound marketing the whole time, aren't you, Chris?
Sorry?
That big social presence of yours?
Yeah, exactly.
Does that get followers coming and people hear about you and what you're doing?
Absolutely. So I think it's, it's definitely, I said once in an interview that I've done at least 6 figures worth of business through Twitter alone. I come from this position that I don't believe that that business owners make economic buying decisions, especially at the gradient that we're talking about, which is north of $30,000 a year, on internet marketing or advertising, right? You may plant the seed, but what they're doing is they're viewing the website, they're viewing your LinkedIn, they're doing their due diligence, and that's a really important point in terms of the qualification process. Is that sort of that research and background checking. So I think the most important thing for us was making sure that I suppose our presence and our partners' presence online is exactly what the client wants to see from someone that engage with at that level.
So you've got a strong, clear, opinionated, which is a good thing, digital presence, which really is part of marketing. It's not part of traditional marketing, what probably most firms are doing.
Yeah.
But that's been a core part. Great.
Yeah, so we're not doing like pay-per-click, ads on Google or Facebook or anything like that. We've experimented with it, and generally, I'd say the results have been disappointing in that respect. So it's definitely like pull type marketing rather than push marketing.
And if you're doing good authority building work online in terms of social and content articles, you don't need to top your inbound traffic up with paid traffic if you're already getting it organically.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, MC, is that all of our partners are very tightly niched within a specific industry segment. So if you want to become the number one thought leader on accounting for the automotive industry, I can guarantee you that there isn't an accountant in Australia that's planted a flag in that, which means it's up for grabs, right? And then you can work on building your relationships with the Motor Trade Association, industry bodies.
Exactly.
Yourself so that you're talking at their conferences and publishing in their magazines and their websites and all of that sort of stuff.
Beautiful.
So that you're the only person that people in that industry actually see when it comes to accounting and finance.
Awesome. Yeah, one of our favorite phrases from Herman Simon, inch wide, mile deep. Yep. Become a frickin' legend in a pond that's small, not too small,
yep,
but a specific pond anyway.
What's really interesting about what you've said, Chris, I've just been sitting here thinking, when I look at, so we deal with over 1,000 accounting firms, and when you take out the big logo guys, the guys who are really smashing it, they're having the strategic plans done, doing their forecasting, their mentoring work with clients, are ones like you who are getting out there, building a personal brand, but showing by your values and who you are that you're a cool person to work with. You're a new dad, you're very loyal to Adelaide, you've got the family side too, and I think that personal connection comes through. And it's not natural for accountants to necessarily do that, but the new generation coming through, I think you're going to find it's just essential that the Chris Hoopers and the Steph Hineses, etc., are going to become more the norm than the exception. So looking into your crystal ball, I'm getting the buzz from the producer that we're almost out of time. But looking into your crystal ball, where do you see the profession heading? You said that you always try and stay ahead of the curve. What should we be looking out for in the next 5 years?
In the next 5 years? I think the one thing that's surprised me is actually that the profession is moving slower than any of my models had predicted. So we expected a much faster adoption of cloud technology, which hasn't actually come into effect. So in terms of what I expect from the profession across the board is, to be honest with you, not a huge amount, right? I think, honestly, in 5 years' time, we will still be having the same conversations that are being had at conferences, espousing the virtues of cloud, of advisory, and all of the stuff that we've been talking about to date. I think some of the stuff that Accodex will be playing in 5 years' time will be much heavier in terms of blockchain technology. We are dealing with a few sort of technical considerations in terms of public ledgers that have some pretty profound implications on the accounting profession. So that's where we're trying to keep ahead of the curve. I am fingers crossing that augmented reality actually becomes a larger part of just everyday work. So we're kind of looking around the office going, are we going to need these computer screens for much longer? So definitely holding off on the CapEx there. The other thing is, I think about, spinning off from that augmented reality thing, is that this business intelligence that we're talking about, 2 points on it. The first one is that I think the data or the visualization is actually going to get a little more interactive and three-dimensional. So the ability to actually drill deeper into your business intelligence, or, down to GL level.
Sure.
That full Minority Report kind of vision where it's like I've got my HoloLens on and then I'm zooming in without
or arguably, and I won't say too much, or more predictive, looking out and modeling what.
Yeah, well, that was the next part that I was going to say in terms of those two things with business intelligence, is using machine learning to actually dive into that data. Because when you just on a general ledger basis alone, you go through 10 years worth of GL, and humans there's just so much nuance that humans can't really pick up on. So it's really important to us that our partners are delivering a very consistent service and outcome for their clients. And that's very difficult to do because one accountant may see something that another accountant might not. Machine learning will make sure that, you know, the machine itself is actually picking that up across the board. So I'm expecting a little more like, you know, active and dynamic intelligence to actually be produced by machines. So I'm really excited to see where that kind of, you know, pans out over the next 5 years.
You are indeed a futurist. One last question from me, Chris.
Sure.
Putting ourselves into the shoes or maybe the earbuds of the progressive accountants and advisors around the world listening to us now, from a visible behaviour perspective, in terms of a task and action that they can do differently next week, considering that roughly 1 in 10 accounting firms surveyed through benchmarking reports like what you've done, Richard, at Spotlight, and what Business Fitness in Australia does with the Good, Bad, Ugly, only 1 in 10 firms are doing much advisory, but 9 out of 10 state they want to. What one thing across either marketing the advisory to attract the right clients in the first place, or the sales process to land the engagements, or to deliver those better, what's one visible behaviour that a listener can do differently from today, from tomorrow onwards?
Ask the questions, simple as. So either a new prospective client walks in the door, and instead of just telling them that you can do what they want you to do, ask them questions, and that's it. There should be a standardized process in terms of what questions are being asked, because it's part of the diagnosis process, right? So the only, you know, and it's really easy to implement. Yeah? It's called, you know, use a template if you need to. You go into a meeting and you've got a list of questions that you're not allowed to walk out of that meeting without having answered. Done.
Brilliant.
You know, like that can be implemented tomorrow with no real headaches or anything like that.
Humans do advisory at the end of the day. So.
Yeah, right. And
exactly.
I mean, the thing is, you can worry about the technical implications and how you're going to actually deliver on that value proposition, like after the fact, right? I do think in this profession, we tend to preoccupy ourselves with the framework and the infrastructure and getting all of our ducks in a row in terms of how we're going to deliver this service before we've even got a customer through the door, right? I suppose, you know, I would get a customer first and then, you know, tank your budget, blow your budget massively if you need to, because in blowing that budget, you're going to be building, you know, infrastructure and capacity so that, you know, the next client that you get, you'll be able to a little better, a little quicker, and a little more efficiently, you know, the next one.
Yeah, you're willing to invest in prototyping those services up as you go. Yeah, you can't steer a parked car. You can't sit around and think about delivering advisory. You just got to get in there and do it.
Good analogy.
Good advice. Okay, so Chris, in wrapping up, if there's an angry young accountant listening right now that wants to find out more about Accodex, what do you suggest is a good next step?
Google, just go to Google, type in Accodex, and go through our website. If that stuff resonates with you, by all means, just drop us a line.
So Accodex, for those listening, ACCODEX.
That's the one.
Accodex, wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And Richard, if people want to find out more about how they can use the Spotlight reporting tools to facilitate advisory, what's a good next step there?
Yeah, sure. Come along to spotlightreporting.com. Lots of case studies there. Get your hands on the Transform book, which Mr. Hooper is in, and lots of other great accountants. And, you know, look, the people in the book and on the website are the future of the industry. So there's lots of pathfinders there for you to follow.
Cool. And my suggestion for next step from this episode is just to go to Google, as Chris suggested, but in this case, search on the value pyramid for accountants and advisors, maybe our practice paradox to the end of it, and read the series of articles so you can understand where the opportunities lie for delivering value beyond the real-time data and compliance and start to move into the clarity, commentary, accountability, because that is what, even though they're not asking for it until you educate them, as you said earlier, Chris, they don't know what they don't know. So it's the accountants and advisors' role to educate the business market around how they can actually help them predict and create a future. All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris, for taking time out of your day to be with Richard and I today.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
And thanks everyone for joining us for the very first episode ever of Advisory Advantage. We'll see you again for episode number 2. If you've got any questions, let us know, and we'll post the show notes and any links under this episode for you to find out. Bye for now.